We organize the toolbars based on transforms, based on materials, based on lighting, based on cameras, based on rendering, based on layers, transform constraints, and then simple file management. And you're probably like, well, how am I going to remember all this? On the O drive, under training, and 3ds Max, this is where all the course documents for today live. So we'll see our syllabus here. You can read in your own time. We're under level 1 tutorial files, and we're under interface. So there's also, if you forget any of this stuff or what anything is, there's a nice graphic on the 3ds Max interface for you. And there's also an SCB customization that goes over what every single button does in 3ds Max that we have on our systems. And it goes from left to right. So this is my selection filter. This one is my selection, so it just allows me to select objects. If I get lost and I can't select anything, I just click on that again. Then I'm only selecting. This one is select by name. So again, I have 5 boxes, right? If I change the name of this box to be test or whatever it may be, under select by name, I can see test, right? So I can select multiple boxes. I can also filter. So here is my geometry filter, my display shapes filter, my lights filter, so on and so forth. My crossing window, so my crossing window is going to be, I can do a circular window. I can do a polygonal window, so this will allow me to make a selection based on some arbitrary shape, so you'll see it only picks things in that shape. I use this one a lot. Right? I can draw where I want to select. I've actually never used that one. Paint selection region. So I can paint over what I want. My selection filter. So under my filter, let's say I had a camera in my scene, and I had a light in my scene. Right? Right now, if I go to select this, I'm selecting everything. Well, let's say I only wanted to select lights. Under that filter, I can select only lights. And right, I'm selecting everything, but it's only grabbing the lights. Or I can select only cameras. Or I can select only geometry. That one's really helpful. Selection sets, right? We've already gone over snaps. And that's here on the keyboard, also here. The selection sets, so let's say this is building set A on design or phase A, right? I could go to my name selection sets and do a new one and call selection A. And box 2 and 4 belong to A. And then I could say, well, these are then on selection set B. Right, so then in my filter, I can go, I want to select B, or I want to select A on the fly. If I want to group everything together, I can group with point. Right, so I can still move objects within my group. Turn off my snaps here. Make sure all is selected. Right, and then I can also then select my point, and it will still move my point, and I can make that point smaller or bigger based on its modifier objects. Right, so that's like a little helper, what we call a helper object, right? Random transform is something that's fun. So if I had a bunch of trees, we'll get into this definitely tomorrow. Let's say I had this object and it's a tree, right, and I have 10 different trees, or 3 in this case. I can transform this randomly, so I say that each one of these is going to get a scale in the Z direction that's random between this value and this value. and I can randomly transform those objects. I can mirror objects. So if I select only geometry here, and I mirror that, I make sure I do an instance of that geometry, and I can use my mirror with an offset, right? Or in the z-axis or the y-axis. Select all my geometry. I can do an align function. So let's say I have this box and I want to align it to this object. I click on align and I say I want you to align, and I can choose whether or not I want it on minimum or the center pivot, whether or not it's on the x or y axis or the z axis or both or all three. I can match my scale of that object, target objects, minimum, maximum, so on and so forth. I can do this auto grid. So this auto grid works for creating geometry on other geometry. So I click on box. Right, I can draw on the faces of objects. Right, if I want to array an object, so the array function, I have to move my hierarchy panel, or my hierarchy of my pivot. I'll use my pivot placer to go to the corner. I can do a circular array, so I move my pivot out, then my circular array is here, and I can apply based on that center pivot. Or if I want to take one object and I want to array it in a rectangular fashion, I can do that as well. I can do a preview. There we go. If I have a plane, right, so let's say I have some type of geometry that's like this. Turn off my auto grid. And I want to do my segments more and edit poly so I can access. So what I just did was I made a plane, and on its object properties, I can increase the length and width segments, so it's division of that surface. And then I added this edit poly modifier onto it, which means I can grab vertex points of this object, I can grab edges of this object's subsurface, singular faces of the subsurfaces, and the full object on its own. Right, so maybe I want to create a warp surface of some sort. I select it and go up. So what I have to recap on this, what I've done here, make sure I got audio going here. What I've done is I've turned this to the edit poly, right? I can select sub-object levels of this, right? I'm in the soft selection, so my fall off distance, right? I can adjust, whoops, here. So you'll see 3 different colors, so now it's going to softly grow that. If I go F3, right, I can see a little bit of shadow, so the object's like that. I can exit out of my edit poly, so now I'm set with this. I can always go back to the original plane at any time. Turn that off, turn that on, right? And I can adjust the width of this thing under the plane object, yes. Make it bigger. I go back to my edit poly and turn that on, right? So it stretches that. And then with the...
What if you change the grid then on this? Would it then be tracked with that?
Yeah. So if I change the grid, I go back to the plane. Turn on my edit poly. It just shifts that over. Yeah, it's good for, Max is great for terrain. We have a terrain modifier specifically that takes contours and makes the terrain out of it. It's a lot nicer. When I want to paint objects, so I have this hilly surface, right? So imagine this is my tree object. I want to paint that object onto this surface. I open up the object painter and I add my surface to the paint on selection, and I select my box or my car, Or for this matter, maybe I want all these objects on, and I add those to my list, and it'll randomly pick objects to place on my surface, right? And I can tell it to orient the piece which way it wants. So it's a quick way to lay out trees, cars, and people randomly on objects. All the other things, right, my materials we'll get into tomorrow. Lighting we'll get into a little bit, right? I can create a light, I can create a sunlight. No. I can toggle on lights and whatnot. Right, I can create cameras from the toolbars. File management, we have links, we have XREFs, and merging of files. Right, maybe I want to see through this object here. It'll allow me to ghost that view in so I can see through the object and see pieces where it's going through. And we went over pivoting. Layers, generally don't use them in 3ds Max unless we have to. We usually do that with the modeling programs that we use. And then again, rendering is our setup, our new render setup windows, make things a lot easier to do. That's all the emails you've been seeing about Solid Rocks. This is the object in question. This is our new render preset menu. And then our submission to deadline. So the deadline is the render farm, which we'll get into at the very end of everything. And that is brought up by the ThinkBox deadline guy down here. So it'll allow me to submit jobs from 3ds Max and get renderings off of my local workstation and over to the in-house render farm.